My phone screen has been lighting up like a strobe light for the past 3 hours. 150 missed calls, 50 voice messages filled with hysterical sobbing and desperate pleas for financial rescue. I just sit here on my velvet sofa looking out over the downtown skyline, swirling a glass of Cabernet, and watching the notifications roll in. My mother Vivian sent a text begging me to remember that we share the same blood. My sister Jada left a voicemail screaming that dangerous debt collectors are looking for her white fiancé Connor. My father Marcus even tried calling from a different number hoping I would pick up. It is almost funny considering what they said to me just a short time ago. Let me take you back to Christmas Eve at my parents' sprawling home in Prince George County, Maryland. We were sitting around a massive dining table with 60 of our closest relatives. The kind of upper-middle-class family gathering where everyone is competing to show off their latest promotion or designer watch. I was quietly eating my meal when my mother tapped her crystal wine glass to get everyone's attention. She looked right at me with a cold, calculating stare and delivered an ultimatum that stopped the entire room. She said, "Pay $100,000 for your sister's dream wedding at the Magnolia Estate, or you are dead to this family." Before I could even process the sheer audacity of her demand, my father stood up, pushing his heavy mahogany chair back. He pointed his finger at me and announced that every single person at this table agrees that you owe her this. He actually said that I owed my golden child sister a luxury wedding because I am 33, single, childless, and supposedly hoarding my money. My aunts and uncles, the same people who constantly ask me for loans, nodded along in agreement. Connor, my sister's fiancé, just sat there with a smug, privileged smirk on his face, thinking he had secured his payday. He always played the part of the elite Silicon Valley tech genius bringing status to our family. They all thought they had me cornered. They thought the pressure of the entire family would break me and force me to write a massive check. They thought I was just a lucky corporate worker who needed their validation to survive. I simply smiled, stood up, and dropped a crisp $100 bill on my plate to cover my portion of the turkey. I told them I was leaving and walked right out the front door into the freezing night. Before I continue this story and tell you exactly how I turned the tables, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the black sheep who ended up holding all the cards. Now they are calling me 150 times a day, begging for my help. But let me tell you exactly why I sat back, poured a glass of wine, and let them dig their own graves. The air in my parents' custom-built dining room was thick with the scent of roasted turkey, candied yams, and the overwhelming stench of my mother's expensive perfume. The entire setup was a desperate display of wealth, designed specifically to impress one person at the table: Connor. My sister Jada sat next to him, wearing a dress that cost more than her monthly salary, clinging to his arm like he was a winning lottery ticket. Connor sat there swirling a glass of $200 scotch that I had brought as a gift, acting as if he owned the place. He had this infuriating habit of speaking to my family like we were some sort of charity project he was generously sponsoring. He would drop tech buzzwords into every conversation to assert his dominance, while my family nodded along as if he were a prophet. My mother Vivian was in her element. She had spent the entire evening bragging to our extended family about Connor and his supposed Silicon Valley tech startup. She made sure everyone within a 5-mile radius knew that Jada was marrying a white tech executive. To my mother, this was not just a wedding. It was a massive elevation in our social status. It was her ultimate victory lap. She had spent her entire life obsessing over appearances, trying to prove to her country club friends that our family was part of the elite. And I was the designated sponsor for her grand illusion. The clinking of silverware stopped when my mother tapped her crystal wine glass with a silver spoon. The room of 60 relatives went dead silent. She stood up, smoothing her silk dress, and plastered on a smile that did not reach her eyes. She started her speech by praising Jada and Connor, calling them a power couple destined for greatness. She talked about how their union was going to open so many doors for our family name. Then her gaze slowly shifted across the long table and locked onto me. The smile vanished completely, replaced by a sneer. She sighed heavily, making sure the entire room felt her profound disappointment. She announced that while Jada was stepping into high society, I was stagnating in my lonely, miserable life. She actually pointed at me and told the room that I was 33 years old, without a husband, without a child, and wasting my life working in an office. She called me a tragic spinster who only had cold, hard cash to keep her warm at night. The aunties and uncles shifted in their seats, but no one said a single word in my defense. Then she dropped the bomb. She said that since I had no real responsibilities and no family of my own to provide for, I needed to make myself useful for once. She announced that Jada had found her absolute dream wedding venue called the Magnolia Estate. She looked me dead in the eye and said the venue and catering will cost exactly $100,000, and as the older sister, it is your absolute duty to pay for it. I set my fork down slowly. I looked at Jada, who was pouting her lips in this exaggerated, innocent expression she had perfected since childhood. Jada leaned forward and said in a sugary, sweet voice that it would mean the absolute world to her. She claimed that Connor's family was flying in from Palo Alto and they could not be embarrassed by hosting a cheap budget wedding. She actually said I needed to do this for the culture and for the prestige of the family name. I kept my voice completely level and politely declined. I said I was happy for her engagement, but I would not be funding a $100,000 party. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's face turned a dangerous shade of red. Her voice escalated into a sharp, piercing shriek. She called me a selfish, bitter woman who was jealous of her younger sister's happiness. She said I was trying to sabotage Jada because no man had ever wanted to marry me, and I could not stand to see my sister get the fairy tale ending I was denied. That is when Connor decided to chime in. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and looked at me with this insufferable, patronizing expression. He told me that in his social circles, hosting a wedding at a premier location like the Magnolia Estate was just the baseline. He chuckled softly and said that if $100,000 was a liquidity issue for me, his personal wealth manager could give me some basic financial literacy tips. The absolute audacity of this man trying to lecture me about money when I knew exactly what his financial portfolio actually looked like took everything in me not to laugh right in his face. My father, Marcus, finally spoke up to seal the deal. He slammed his hand on the table, making the expensive china rattle. He used that deep authoritarian tone he always used to force us into submission growing up. He told me that family protects family, and that I was disrespecting the sacrifices they made to raise me. He demanded that I stop embarrassing them in front of Connor and write the check by the end of the week. I looked around the long dining table. I saw my aunts and uncles nodding along in silent agreement. These were the same people who constantly asked me to cover their utility bills or pay for their kids' college textbooks. None of them defended me. They all looked at me like I was a stubborn, broken ATM that was rudely refusing to dispense cash. My mother delivered her final ultimatum. She pointed her manicured finger at the front door and screamed that if I did not pay for my sister's dream wedding, I was completely dead to this family. She told me to get out of her house and never come back until I had a cashier's check in my hand. I did not cry. I did not yell back. I did not try to defend my career or explain the massive investment empire I had built completely on my own. I simply picked up my designer purse and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. I dropped it right on top of my half-eaten slice of turkey. I looked my mother directly in the eye and told her that was to cover the cost of my dinner. I looked at Jada and told her good luck affording the wedding. Then I turned around and walked out the front door into the freezing December night. They thought my silence was a sign of defeat. They thought kicking me out was a harsh punishment that would quickly force me to crawl back and beg for their forgiveness. They had absolutely no idea that as I started my car and drove away from that toxic house, I was already anticipating my next move. I was completely at peace because I knew a secret about the Magnolia Estate that would soon bring their entire fake luxurious world crashing down around them. As I gripped the leather steering wheel of my car, the cold December air blasting from the vents, I let the reality of what had just happened wash over me. The sheer audacity of that dining room confrontation was still ringing in my ears. To truly understand why I walked out, you have to understand the terrifying level of delusion that hijacked my family dinner. It was a masterclass in manipulation led by the patriarch of the family himself. When my mother had delivered her ridiculous ultimatum, the room had fallen into a heavy, suffocating silence. But that silence was immediately shattered by my father, Marcus. He is a man who has always believed that his booming voice and physical presence could bend reality to his will. He pushed his heavy mahogany dining chair back with such force that it scraped violently against the hardwood floor. He stood up, towering over the table, his chest puffed out like a general preparing to discipline a disobedient soldier. He pointed a thick finger directly at my face and used his deepest, most authoritative tone. He announced to the entire room that in this house we respect family hierarchy. He said that Jada marrying Connor was a monumental step forward for our family name, and that my refusal to pay for the wedding was a direct insult to him as my father. He actually looked me in the eye and said that every single person at this table agrees that you owe her this. He demanded that I stop embarrassing our family in front of our honored guest. That honored guest was Connor. I glanced over at my sister's fiancé. Connor was a white man who wore his supposed Silicon Valley status like a crown. He was sitting back in his chair, casually swirling his scotch, thoroughly entertained by the spectacle unfolding in front of him. He looked like a colonial overseer watching the locals fight for his approval. He did not look uncomfortable or embarrassed by my family demanding money from me. Instead, he looked smugly satisfied. My family was actively performing for him, desperate to prove they belonged in his proximity to whiteness and imaginary wealth. They were willing to tear down their own flesh and blood just to secure his validation. As if my father's booming demands were not enough, the chorus of hypocrites immediately joined in. My Aunt Valerie, who was wearing a designer dress she bought with money I had lent her last spring, leaned across the table. She shook her head in exaggerated disappointment and told me I was being bitter. She said I had more money than I knew what to do with, and that my refusal was just pure selfishness. Then my Uncle Jerome chimed in. This is the same Uncle Jerome whose mortgage I paid off 3 years ago when he was facing foreclosure. He pointed his fork at me and loudly proclaimed that an unmarried woman with no children should feel privileged to contribute to her sister's marital foundation. They all started talking over each other, a chaotic symphony of relatives calling me cold, jealous, and ungrateful. They accused me of trying to sabotage Jada's happiness because I was resentful of her perfect relationship. They wanted me to break. They wanted me to raise my voice, to cry, to throw a tantrum, so they could label me as the angry, unstable woman and justify their cruelty. But I refused to give them that satisfaction. My heart rate did not even elevate. I sat there in my tailored suit, perfectly composed, observing them with clinical detachment. I realized in that exact moment that they did not see me as a daughter, a sister, or a niece. To them, I was nothing more than a financial utility, a bank account they felt entitled to drain to fund their delusions of grandeur. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. The movement was so calm and deliberate that the shouting around the table immediately died down. Everyone stared at me, expecting me to pull out my checkbook and surrender to their collective bullying. My father crossed his arms, looking smugly victorious, thinking his patriarchal intimidation had worked. Jada leaned her head against Connor's shoulder, wearing a triumphant little smile. I looked directly at my Aunt Valerie and Uncle Jerome. I kept my voice incredibly soft but sharp as glass. I told them that the next time they wanted to lecture me about family loyalty, they should first repay the $50,000 they collectively owed me. Their faces drained of color instantly. The smug expressions vanished, replaced by absolute panic as the rest of the table turned to look at them. Then I turned my attention to my father. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that respect is earned through protection and care, not demanded through public humiliation. I told him that selling out his own daughter to impress a man who had not even married into the family yet was the true embarrassment. I watched the veins bulge in his neck as he struggled to find a response to my absolute defiance. Finally, I picked up my designer handbag from the back of my chair. I unclasped the hardware, reached inside, and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. The room was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. I held the bill up for a brief second, making sure every single person at that massive table saw it. Then I let it flutter down, landing perfectly on top of my half-eaten plate of food. I looked at my mother, whose face was frozen in a mask of pure shock. I delivered my final words with absolute clarity. I said, "This is for my portion of the turkey. As for Jada's wedding, I am not funding a single cent." I did not wait for their reaction. I simply turned around and walked away. My heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor, echoing through the silent house. I did not look back. Not when my father shouted my name, and not when my mother shrieked that I was dead to them. I walked out the front door into the freezing December night, breathing in the crisp air of my newfound freedom. That brings me back to right now, sitting in my apartment with my phone buzzing off the hook. They thought they could break me with their group intimidation. They thought cutting me off would be my ultimate punishment. But their arrogant demands and their desperate need to impress Connor blinded them to the reality of who they were actually messing with. They have no idea that their actions tonight have set off a chain reaction they cannot stop. Because tomorrow morning, I am not just going to ignore their calls. I am going to make sure their fake, luxurious world crumbles to the ground. As I had reached my car in the driveway last night, the front door had ripped open behind me. My mother stood on the porch with the icy wind whipping her silk dress, screaming that I was dead to her. She shouted that I would die alone and that my name was officially erased from this family. Through the expansive dining room window, I could see Connor watching the entire spectacle. He was leaning against the glass with a contemptuous pout on his face, offering me a slow, dismissive wave. He looked at me as if I were a peasant being banished from his kingdom. I simply locked eyes with him, put my car in drive, and rolled out of the gates, leaving their screaming and posturing in the rearview mirror. I woke up the next morning in my penthouse to the soft hum of the city below. The sunlight was pouring through my floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm glow over my living room. For the first time in my life, waking up on Christmas morning did not fill me with a sense of dread or obligation. There were no fake smiles to practice. There was no need to shrink myself to make Jada shine brighter. I walked into my kitchen, brewed a fresh cup of espresso, and sat at the marble island. I was ready to enjoy a peaceful, quiet holiday completely detached from their toxic orbit. Then my phone vibrated against the countertop. It was not a text message from a relative. It was not another unhinged voicemail from my father. It was a high-priority push notification from my comprehensive credit monitoring service. I unlocked my screen, and a glaring red alert filled the display. It was a critical fraud warning. My heart rate stayed perfectly steady as I tapped the notification and opened the secure application. I scrolled down to the details of the alert. There was a recent hard inquiry on my credit report, followed immediately by a newly approved personal line of credit from a major national bank. I stared at the approval amount. It was exactly $100,000. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it washed over me like ice water. My mother and sister had not just been making empty demands at the dinner table. They had a backup plan already in motion. Vivian has always been meticulous about keeping records, and she still possessed copies of my old tax forms and childhood documents from before I moved out. She had my social security number. She had all my vital personal information. In their twisted, narcissistic minds, they genuinely believed they were entitled to my wealth. They decided that if I was not going to hand over a check willingly, they would simply forge my signature, steal my identity, and take out a massive loan in my name to fund Jada's extravagant wedding. They actually thought they could pull off a six-figure financial fraud and get away with it. I knew exactly how they rationalized this crime. Vivian probably convinced Jada that I would simply pay off the loan silently once I discovered it. They banked on the age-old toxic family rule that we do not air our dirty laundry in public. They assumed I would rather swallow a $100,000 debt than risk sending my own mother and sister to a federal prison, especially not when they were trying so desperately to impress Connor and his supposedly elite family. They thought my desire to protect our family reputation would override my sense of self-preservation. They were dead wrong. I did not panic. I did not drop my coffee mug or burst into tears. I did not immediately call my mother to scream and demand answers. Screaming is what victims do when they feel powerless. I was not powerless. I was a millionaire venture capitalist who dealt with hostile takeovers and corporate sabotage for a living. This was no longer a petty family dispute over a holiday dinner. This was a severe federal crime: identity theft, credit fraud, forgery. By crossing this line, Vivian and Jada had handed me the exact ammunition I needed to completely dismantle their fake reality. They wanted to play a high-stakes financial game to impress a man who looked down on us. Now I was going to show them what real financial consequence actually looks like. I set my coffee down and opened my laptop. I had 3 immediate phone calls to make. One to the fraud department of the bank to freeze the newly opened account. One to the credit bureaus to lock down my social security number. And one to the authorities to file an official police report for identity theft against my own mother and sister. The holidays were officially over, and the war they had unknowingly started was about to begin. My first call was directly to the Executive Fraud Division of the National Bank. Working in venture capital means I do not wait in standard customer service queues. I have a dedicated wealth manager. I provided my secure identification code and calmly explained that a fraudulent line of credit had been opened using my social security number. I instructed them to freeze the account immediately, flag it for federal investigation, and decline any pending transactions. The bank representative verified my identity and confirmed the freeze was active within exactly 4 minutes. My second call was to the 3 major credit bureaus. I placed a permanent hard lock on my credit profile. No one would be able to open so much as a department store credit card in my name ever again. My third call was to the local police department. I filed a formal police report for felony identity theft and credit fraud. I provided the officer with my mother's address and the exact details of the fraudulent account. I wrote down the police case number on a notepad with a gold pen, feeling a deep, profound sense of calm. There was no screaming on my end. There was no dramatic confrontation. I was simply letting the heavy machinery of the financial and legal systems do the dirty work for me. While I was sipping my espresso in the quiet luxury of my penthouse, my sister Jada was busy living out her fraudulent fantasy. Based on the transaction attempt alerts pinging on my phone, I knew exactly where she was. She was at Veronique Bridal, an ultra-exclusive boutique downtown that requires a $10,000 minimum purchase just to book a fitting appointment. It is the kind of place where they serve vintage champagne and treat you like royalty provided your credit card actually clears. I could picture the scene perfectly. Jada was definitely standing on a velvet pedestal surrounded by gilded mirrors, wearing a custom-imported silk gown. Our mother Vivian was likely sitting on a plush sofa, boasting loudly to anyone who would listen. More importantly, I knew Connor's mother was there. Vivian had been desperate to invite her to the dress fitting to prove our family had the financial weight to match their supposed Silicon Valley prestige. They were putting on a grand theatrical performance of generational wealth, all funded by my stolen identity. According to my bank alerts, Jada walked up to the marble checkout counter at exactly 11:15 in the morning. She was ready to pay a $35,000 deposit for her custom gown and matching veil. She probably smiled that smug, entitled smile of hers as she handed the sales associate a shiny new card linked directly to the fraudulent account they had opened in my name. My phone vibrated heavily on the kitchen island. A notification flashed on the screen, showing a declined transaction at Veronique Bridal for $35,000. I closed my eyes and smiled, picturing the exact moment the color drained from my sister's face. I can imagine the sales associate looking down at the terminal with a polite but strained expression. She would try swiping the card a second time, then a third. The machine would flash the same relentless red error code. The associate would have to look across the counter at my sister and say those devastating words loud enough for the entire entourage to hear. "I am sorry, ma'am, but this card has been locked due to suspected fraud." Jada would immediately panic. She would snatch the card back, claiming there must be a mistake with their machine. She would tell them she just opened the account and that she had a $100,000 limit. She would demand they run it again. Vivian would rush to the counter, her face flushed, trying to laugh it off as a simple banking error. Vivian would try to save face in front of Connor's wealthy white mother by acting outraged at the boutique's incompetence. But the boutique manager would step in. High-end retail managers have zero tolerance for declined cards and fraud alerts. They would politely but firmly inform Jada that the account was completely locked by the fraud department and that she needed to provide a different form of payment immediately. Of course, Jada did not have another form of payment. Her own credit cards were maxed out from funding her fake luxury lifestyle on social media. Vivian certainly did not have $35,000 sitting in her checking account. Connor's mother would be watching this entire humiliating spectacle unfold from the velvet sofa. She would see her future daughter-in-law throwing a temper tantrum at a cash register, unable to afford the dress she had just spent 2 hours parading around in. The grand illusion of our family's wealth would shatter right there in the middle of Veronique Bridal. The mask would slip, revealing the desperate grifters hiding underneath. Jada would be forced to step back into the dressing room, take off the custom silk gown, and hand it back to the attendant. She and my mother would have to walk out of that boutique empty-handed, completely disgraced in front of the exact people they were trying to impress. The humiliation would be absolute and devastating. My phone vibrated again. Another notification popped up. Jada was trying to log into the banking app using the fraudulent credentials, attempting to see why the card was blocked. The bank security system instantly locked the IP address and sent me an alert about a compromised login attempt. A second later, my phone started ringing. It was Jada. She was calling me. I stared at her name flashing on the screen. The absolute panic was clearly setting in as she realized the stolen money was gone and her dream wedding was collapsing before it even started. I reached out, tapped the red button, and sent the call straight to voicemail. Then the text messages started flooding in. First from Jada, demanding to know why the card was not working. Then from my mother asking if I had done something to the account. They still thought they could bully me into submission. They still thought I would cave to their pressure. They had no idea that freezing the money was only the first step. My phone did not stop buzzing. When the text messages went unanswered and the phone calls were sent straight to voicemail, my sister did exactly what she always does when she throws a tantrum. She took it to the internet. Jada has always possessed a dangerous talent for manipulating reality to fit her victim narrative, and social media was her favorite stage. Within an hour of the humiliating incident at Veronique Bridal, a notification popped up on my screen indicating that Jada had gone live on Instagram and uploaded a highly edited video to TikTok. I mirrored my phone to the large flat-screen television in my living room, poured myself another cup of coffee, and sat back to watch the performance. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. The video started with Jada sitting in the passenger seat of my mother's luxury SUV. Her makeup was slightly smudged, deliberately done to look like she had been crying for hours. She looked directly into the camera with wide, tear-filled eyes. She took a shaky breath, performing the perfect picture of a devastated bride. She started weaving a completely fabricated story for her thousands of followers. She claimed that I had generously offered to buy her wedding dress as a gift to celebrate her engagement. She sobbed to the camera, telling her audience that I had encouraged her to pick out the most beautiful, expensive gown in the city. Then, according to Jada's fairy tale, I waited until the exact moment she was standing at the cash register, right next to Connor's wealthy mother, to maliciously cancel my credit card. She wiped away a fake tear and asked her audience why her own flesh and blood would want to destroy her special day. She called me a bitter, lonely woman who could not stand to see anyone else happy. She told her followers that I had set her up in a calculated plot just to humiliate her because I was intensely jealous of her perfect relationship with Connor. She used all the trending buzzwords to maximize sympathy. She called me a toxic sibling. She claimed she was surviving narcissistic family abuse. She played the innocent, heartbroken bride whose dream wedding was being held hostage by a cruel spinster sister. The backlash was instantaneous and explosive. Within 30 minutes, the video had racked up tens of thousands of views. My notifications completely shifted from my mother's angry texts to an absolute avalanche of abuse from our extended family and Jada's online army. The family group chat, which I had muted but not yet left, turned into a digital firing squad. Aunt Valerie, the same woman whose designer wardrobe was funded by my personal bank account, left a screeching voice note. She yelled that I was a complete embarrassment to black women everywhere for tearing down my own sister in front of a prominent white family. She said I was a disgrace to our bloodline. Uncle Jerome sent a massive paragraph calling me a cold-hearted snake who would die alone surrounded by nothing but my money. My cousins flooded my direct messages with snake emojis and trash can icons. These were the very same cousins whose college tuitions, emergency car repairs, and rent deposits I had quietly subsidized over the past 5 years. They called me toxic. They called me a traitor. They told me I needed intense psychological help for my supposed jealousy issues. They said I was a miserable, unlovable woman taking my failures out on a young bride who was just trying to build a beautiful life. I sat in my penthouse watching the hateful comments roll in across every platform. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not shed a tear. Instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of validation. This massive coordinated attack was the absolute proof I needed that my family did not view me as a human being. I was just a resource to them. The moment I stopped dispensing cash and allowing them to walk all over me, I instantly became the villain in their twisted reality. They were so quick to believe Jada's tearful performance because it fit the exact narrative my mother had spent decades building. Vivian had always painted me as the difficult, unhappy daughter, while Jada was elevated as the flawless, successful angel. The extended family believed the lie because believing it was easier than admitting they were enabling a family of grifters. I did not reply to a single comment. I did not post a defensive video explaining my side of the story. Defending yourself to a mob only gives them the power and attention they desperately crave. It validates their delusion. Instead, I calmly took high-resolution screenshots of every single abusive text message, every threatening voicemail transcription, and every defamatory public comment. I downloaded Jada's entire tearful video, making sure to capture the specific moments where she explicitly named me and falsely accused me of financial manipulation. I bundled the entire digital package, organized it by timestamp, and forwarded it directly to my legal team. Jada thought she was winning the public relations war. She thought that applying immense social pressure and weaponizing our extended family would break my spirit. She genuinely believed that public shaming would force me to unfreeze the funds and apologize just to save my reputation. She had absolutely no idea that her little social media performance had just handed me a golden ticket. By publicly lying about the financial arrangement and actively defaming my character to thousands of people, Jada had just escalated her crimes. She thought she was playing the victim, but she was actually documenting her own guilt for my lawyers. While my legal team was busy archiving Jada's digital meltdown, my personal phone chimed with a direct message. I glanced at the screen and saw it was from Connor. Until this moment, we had never exchanged a single text. He had always deemed himself too important to communicate with Jada's family outside of formal gatherings where he could perform for an audience. His message was a staggering display of unearned arrogance and weaponized privilege. He did not ask what was going on. He did not ask for my side of the story. Instead, he decided to play the role of the wealthy white savior stepping in to discipline his fiancée's unruly, aggressive black sister. The text read like a poorly scripted corporate threat. He told me that my behavior today was completely unacceptable and that I was causing Jada severe emotional distress. He went on to say that in his world people do not tolerate this kind of petty vindictive harassment. Then came the ultimate bluff. He stated that he was putting me on formal notice. If I did not immediately unfreeze the funds and issue a public apology to Jada, he would unleash his tech company's elite legal team on me. He threatened to bury me in defamation lawsuits and financial ruin, adding a final condescending line instructing me not to mess with resources I could not possibly comprehend. I read the message twice, a genuine smile spreading across my face. It was the text of a man who was completely terrified but trying desperately to project power. I knew exactly how actual billionaires and tech titans operated. Real wealth does not send angry, threatening text messages from a personal iPhone. Real wealth has a general counsel send a formal watermarked cease and desist letter via certified mail. Connor was trying to intimidate me using the illusion of his Silicon Valley status. He assumed I was just a regular working-class woman who would instantly cower at the mere mention of corporate lawyers. He assumed his proximity to whiteness and imaginary capital gave him absolute authority over me. I did not reply. Responding to a bluff only gives it credibility. I simply took a screenshot of his ridiculous threat, forwarded it to my actual elite legal team, and tossed my phone onto the sofa. The silence from my end must have driven them crazy, because just a few hours later, the narrative shifted again. My phone alerted me to a new post on Jada's Instagram page. I cast the video to my television screen. The scene had completely changed from the tearful, victimized performance in our mother's car. Now Jada and Connor were standing in the lavish foyer of what looked like a high-end hotel. They were both holding crystal flutes filled with champagne, beaming at the camera with exaggerated, triumphant smiles. Jada leaned into the frame holding up her glass. She told her followers that she wanted to give a massive update to everyone who had supported her through the traumatic abuse she experienced earlier that day. She said that God always provides for those with pure hearts, and that she was incredibly blessed to be marrying a man who truly protects her. Connor then stepped smoothly into the frame, wrapping a protective arm around her waist. He looked directly into the camera lens with that same insufferable, smug expression he wore at the Christmas dinner table. He announced that nobody was going to ruin his future wife's dream. He proudly declared that they did not need a single dime of dirty money from a bitter, toxic sister. With a theatrical flourish, he raised his glass and announced to the world that he had personally stepped up and officially secured the Magnolia estate for their wedding day. Jada squealed with manufactured delight, kissing him on the cheek. She turned back to the camera and bragged that the deposit was paid, the contract was signed, and they were going to have the most spectacular elite wedding of the season. She ended the video by blowing a kiss to the haters and telling her audience that true love always wins over jealousy. I sat on my velvet sofa watching the video loop back to the beginning. The Magnolia Estate. It is the crown jewel of luxury event venues in the tri-state area. It is a sprawling historic property featuring manicured botanical gardens, a glass conservatory, and a grand ballroom dripping in imported crystal chandeliers. Getting a weekend reservation there requires a wait list of at least 2 years and a financial background check just to book a tour. Jada had been obsessing over this specific venue for months. It was the ultimate status symbol she needed to prove to her followers that she had finally made it into the upper echelons of society. They were bragging to the entire internet about securing this legendary estate. They were mocking me, certain that they had outsmarted me and won the ultimate victory. They thought they had bypassed my financial blockade and proven their independence. I slowly picked up my phone. I did not feel a trace of anger. I felt the pure, unadulterated thrill of a hunter who just watched the prey walk directly into an inescapable trap. I dialed the direct line of my executive assistant, Elena. She answered on the second ring with her usual crisp professionalism. I kept my voice smooth, commanding, and completely devoid of emotion. I told Elena to immediately access the internal booking ledger for the Magnolia estate. I instructed her to locate a newly submitted contract under the name Jada or Connor, or perhaps guaranteed by my mother Vivian. Elena's keyboard clacked rapidly through the phone speaker. Within seconds, she confirmed she had found it. She read the details aloud. The reservation was booked just an hour ago for a premium Saturday in June. The initial deposit had been authorized, and Vivian was listed as the primary financial guarantor. I leaned back against the cushions and gave my final directive. I told Elena to cancel that contract immediately. I ordered her to void the transaction and permanently blacklist the names Jada, Connor, and Vivian from the property management system. I instructed her to draft a formal cancellation notice, citing a violation of our corporate ethics policy regarding credit fraud associated with the guarantor. Furthermore, I commanded that the estate managers are to deny them entry if they ever attempt to step foot on the grounds for a tour. Elena did not ask questions. She simply confirmed the orders and hung up to execute the destruction of my sister's dream. My family had spent years treating me like a peasant. They had demanded my money while simultaneously disrespecting my existence. Connor had tried to intimidate me with his fake tech empire, assuming I was nothing more than an obstacle in his path to my family's perceived wealth. They had absolutely no idea that 4 years ago my venture capital firm had quietly purchased the parent company that manages the region's most exclusive luxury properties. They had no idea that I did not just have the money to pay for a wedding at the Magnolia Estate. I owned the Magnolia Estate. And I was about to teach them exactly what happens when you try to flex on the actual landlord. The very next morning, the sun was shining brightly over the manicured botanical gardens of the Magnolia Estate. I poured myself a fresh cup of tea and opened the secure live feed from the estate's high-definition security cameras on my tablet. Jada had wasted absolutely no time. She arrived at the property at exactly 10 o'clock with a full entourage in tow. She brought her entire bridal party, a professional videographer to capture content for her followers, our mother, Vivian, and of course Connor. They pulled up to the grand iron gates in a rented luxury Sprinter van, stepping out onto the cobblestone driveway, as if they were royalty arriving at their summer palace. Jada was wearing a pristine white tailored suit, holding a bouquet of sample flowers, ready to gloat to the world. Vivian walked right beside her, head held high, adjusting her oversized designer sunglasses and looking down her nose at the valet staff. They swept past the heavy oak doors and right into the grand foyer. It is a breathtaking space featuring dual sweeping staircases and a massive crystal chandelier that cascades from the 3-story ceiling. Jada immediately instructed her videographer to start rolling. Through the camera feed, I watched her twirl in the center of the marble floor, pointing out to her awestruck friends exactly where the string quartet would play and where the champagne tower would be constructed. She was soaking in the adoration, absolutely convinced she had secured the ultimate victory. That is when Mr. Sterling approached them. I had specifically assigned him to handle this interaction because he possesses an impeccable British accent and an absolutely lethal sense of professional detachment. He walked up to the loud, disruptive group with a sleek tablet in hand, his posture perfectly straight, and his expression completely devoid of warmth. Jada clapped her hands together and announced that the bride had arrived for her VIP walkthrough. She demanded the keys to the bridal conservatory and loudly asked for the complimentary mimosa service they had been promised. Mr. Sterling stopped a polite 6 feet away. He looked down at his tablet, then back up at Jada. He stated in a voice that carried clearly across the echoing marble foyer that there must be some confusion. He calmly informed her that there was no reservation under her name, nor was there any VIP walkthrough scheduled for today or any other day. Vivian immediately stepped to the front of the group, bristling with indignation. She pulled off her sunglasses and told Mr. Sterling to check his system again, emphasizing that she was the primary financial guarantor and had paid the premium deposit just yesterday. She demanded to speak to whoever was in charge, threatening to have him fired for ruining her daughter's special day. Mr. Sterling did not flinch. He adjusted his suit jacket and delivered the exact message my assistant Elena had drafted. He informed them that the contract had been completely voided by corporate headquarters late last night. He looked directly at my mother and stated that the cancellation was due to a severe violation of their corporate ethics policy. He explained loud enough for the entire bridal party and the videographer to hear that the guarantor's name had triggered a high-level fraud alert in their financial screening system. He specified that there was an active police report for felony identity theft and credit fraud associated with Vivian's profile, making her legally ineligible to conduct business with their establishment. The silence in that grand foyer was absolute. You could literally hear the soft hum of the air conditioning. Jada's bridesmaids exchanged wide-eyed, horrified glances. The videographer slowly lowered his camera, unsure if he should keep filming this catastrophic humiliation. Vivian's mouth opened and closed, her face turning an alarming shade of crimson as she realized her federal crime had just been broadcast to her daughter's elite social circle. Connor, trying to save face in front of the whispering bridesmaids, puffed out his chest and marched right up to Mr. Sterling. He used his loudest, most entitled tech executive voice. He demanded to know what incompetent management company was running this place. He threatened to call his high-powered lawyers, sue the estate for breach of contract, and completely destroy their reputation in the hospitality industry. Mr. Sterling simply tapped the screen of his tablet. He informed Connor that the estate was owned by a private venture capital firm, and per the direct orders of the CEO, the names Jada Connor and Vivian had been permanently blacklisted. They were banned not just from this estate, but from every other luxury property in the firm's portfolio. Then, with a polite nod, he gestured toward the massive front doors, where two burly security guards had just quietly positioned themselves. He asked them to vacate the premises immediately before he was forced to involve local law enforcement for trespassing. That was the exact moment Jada completely broke. The flawless, confident influencer persona she had spent years crafting evaporated in a split second. She let out a piercing, guttural scream that echoed violently off the marble walls. She stomped her feet in her expensive designer heels, sobbing hysterically, completely, disregarding the fact that her friends were watching her unravel. She turned and screamed at our mother, demanding to know how she could have messed up the financing and ruined her perfect life. She yelled at Connor to do something to fix it, to use his massive tech fortune to make the security guards go away and buy the venue outright. But there was no fixing it. The security guards stepped forward, their imposing presence leaving no room for argument. Jada's bridesmaids were already shuffling toward the exit, heads down, desperately trying to distance themselves from the sheer embarrassment of the situation. Nobody wants to be associated with credit card fraud and public evictions. Vivian grabbed Jada's arm frantically, trying to shush her crying daughter as she dragged her toward the heavy oak doors. Connor stormed out behind them, his face tight with fury and humiliation, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Their grand, triumphant moment, their desperate performance of generational wealth, had been utterly destroyed before it even began. I sat back on my sofa, closed the security feed, and took a slow, satisfying sip of my tea. The first domino had officially fallen. The frantic phone call from Vivian to my father Marcus must have happened the second they piled into that rented Sprinter van. I know exactly how my father operates when his public image is threatened. He does not retreat or reflect. He escalates. He genuinely believes that sheer volume and physical intimidation can bulldoze any corporate policy or legal boundary. Within 2 hours, the head of security at the downtown corporate headquarters of my real estate management firm sent me a direct alert. The entire circus had arrived. I switched my tablet to the lobby camera feed. Marcus, Vivian, Jada, and Connor marched through the revolving glass doors like they were storming a medieval fortress. The corporate lobby is an imposing space made of sleek white marble, brushed steel, and sound-absorbing acoustic panels. It is designed to radiate quiet, absolute power. My father, however, treated it like his own personal living room. He completely ignored the velvet ropes and marched right up to the front desk. He slammed his heavy hand down on the pristine counter, startling the receptionist. He used his booming authoritarian voice so the entire lobby of passing executives and clients could hear him. He demanded to speak to the chief executive officer immediately. He did not ask for a meeting, he demanded an audience. When the receptionist politely asked if he had an appointment, Marcus completely lost his temper. He started shouting about illegal business practices. He aggressively claimed that his family was being subjected to blatant racial discrimination. He yelled that a prestigious black family was being unjustly barred from a public venue, and that he was going to call the local news stations to expose the company. He threatened to organize boycotts and file a massive civil rights lawsuit that would bankrupt the entire management group. He was playing the discrimination card to cover up his wife's federal credit fraud, entirely convinced that the threat of bad press would force the corporate office to immediately hand over the venue. Connor stood right beside him, puffing out his chest to add his imaginary Silicon Valley weight to the argument. He leaned over the desk, pointing a finger at the receptionist. He loudly declared that his tech startup was backed by massive venture capital. He threatened to unleash a team of ruthless corporate lawyers to destroy the property management firm. He said they had messed with the wrong elite family and that the CEO needed to come down and personally apologize to his fiancée. Vivian and Jada stood slightly behind the men, arms crossed, nodding along with every threat. Jada was still wearing her pristine white tailored suit, though it was now wrinkled and her face was streaked with ruined makeup. They looked incredibly smug, completely certain that Marcus and Connor were about to bully a multi-million-dollar corporation into submission. They thought throwing their weight around in a luxury corporate lobby would yield the same results as screaming at a retail worker. I sat in my corner office on the top floor watching this ridiculous display of arrogance on my monitor. My father was so accustomed to demanding respect through fear that he forgot how the real world operates. In the corporate world, screaming in a lobby does not make you powerful. It makes you a liability. I pressed the intercom button on my desk and connected directly to the lobby receptionist's earpiece. I kept my voice perfectly steady and instructed her not to call security to escort them out. Instead, I told her to print 4 visitor badges. I wanted her to invite them up to the executive suite. On the screen, I watched the receptionist nod professionally. She typed on her keyboard, printed the badges, and slid them across the marble counter. She maintained a flawless customer service smile and informed Marcus that the chief executive officer had been briefed on their complaints and was willing to hear their grievances personally. My father snatched the visitor badges off the counter with a triumphant smirk. He turned to Connor, clapping him on the shoulder, looking incredibly proud of himself. He actually believed his loud, aggressive tactics had worked. He thought he had intimidated the corporate executives into a panic. Jada immediately fixed her posture, wiping the smudged mascara from under her eyes, preparing to act like the victorious bride who had just conquered the system. Vivian adjusted her designer handbag, lifting her chin with that signature haughty expression. As they waited for the elevator doors to open, I could see Marcus and Connor feeding off each other's toxic energy. Marcus was reveling in the presence of his white tech executive son-in-law, using Connor's perceived status to validate his own authority. Connor was thoroughly enjoying playing the powerful protector for Jada, cementing his role as the wealthy savior of the family. They were a match made in narcissistic heaven, both fueled by ego and a desperate need to dominate others. The private elevator doors slid open and the 4 of them stepped inside the glass-walled cabin. As the elevator shot up toward the top floor, they were treated to a panoramic view of the downtown skyline. I watched them on the internal cabin camera. They were laughing and adjusting their clothes, completely oblivious to the impending disaster. Vivian was already telling Jada how they were going to demand complimentary champagne service for the inconvenience. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the executive penthouse level. The heavy steel doors glided open, revealing a massive waiting area lined with modern art and dark mahogany paneling. My executive assistant, Elena, was standing there waiting for them with perfect posture. She greeted them formally and asked them to follow her to the CEO's primary boardroom. Marcus led the pack, his chest puffed out, ready to deliver the performance of a lifetime. He was prepared to yell, threaten, and demand the world. He was about to learn the hardest lesson of his life. Elena pushed open the massive frosted glass doors to the primary executive boardroom with practiced grace. She stepped aside, gesturing for the 4 of them to enter. Marcus strode through the doorway first. His chest was puffed out, his chin raised high, and his lungs were fully inflated, ready to unleash a rehearsed tirade about civil rights discrimination and his demands for a formal apology. Vivian and Jada flanked him like loyal foot soldiers, eager to witness an intimidated corporate executive cower before their collective wrath. Connor walked in last, wearing his trademark arrogant smirk, ready to sprinkle his Silicon Valley buzzwords over the conversation to ensure the management team knew exactly how wealthy and important he supposedly was. They stepped onto the thick charcoal carpet of a climate-controlled room designed to project absolute authority. The space was dominated by a 30-foot obsidian glass table that gleamed under the modern geometric lighting fixtures. At the far end of the room, framing a breathtaking panoramic view of the city skyline, sat a high-backed leather executive chair facing the windows. Marcus slammed his hand down on the edge of the obsidian table. The loud smack echoed through the cavernous room. He demanded in his deepest, most threatening voice that the chief executive officer turn around and face him immediately. He declared that his family had been subjected to illegal discrimination and that he was not leaving this building without the keys to the Magnolia estate and a complimentary champagne package for the profound disrespect they had endured. The leather chair slowly swiveled around. The air in the boardroom evaporated. The transformation on their faces was instantaneous, absolute, and spectacular. Marcus froze completely, his mouth hanging half open, the aggressive demands dying instantly in his throat. Vivian let out a sharp, audible gasp, her manicured hand flying to her chest as her designer handbag slipped from her shoulder and hit the carpet with a dull thud. Jada stumbled backward a step, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror, bumping directly into Connor. Connor simply stood there, his brow furrowed in deep confusion, rapidly looking back and forth between the luxury corner office decor and my face completely unable to compute the massive power dynamic shifting in real time. I sat at the head of the table in my tailored slate gray suit, resting my elbows on the armrests, my hands casually steepled in front of me. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply watched them process the reality of their nightmare. Marcus was the first to attempt to break the paralysis. He stammered, his booming voice reduced to a dry, raspy stutter. He demanded to know what kind of sick, twisted joke this was. He looked wildly around the room, asking where the real CEO was genuinely believing that I had somehow sneaked into this office to play a prank on them. He aggressively commanded me to get out of that chair before I got myself arrested for trespassing. I slowly leaned forward and picked up a glossy black folder from my desk. I slid it across the smooth obsidian glass. It glided perfectly down the length of the table, stopping exactly 2 inches from my father's trembling hand. I looked him dead in the eye. I kept my voice incredibly soft, utilizing the acoustic perfection of the room to ensure every syllable cut like a razor blade. I told him there was no joke and no hidden executive waiting in the wings. I told him that I am the chief executive officer and the majority shareholder of this firm. I watched his eyes track down to the folder, which contained the heavily stamped voided contract for their wedding venue. I stated with absolute terrifying clarity that the Magnolia estate, along with every single premium luxury property they had attempted to book in this city, is my private portfolio. Vivian began to hyperventilate. The blood drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking hollow and gray. She shook her head violently, clutching Jada's arm for support. She stammered that this was impossible, that I was just a low-level employee, that I was lying to intimidate them. I reached out and tapped the silver intercom button on my desk. I thanked Elena for escorting the guests up and instructed her to hold all my incoming calls until security was required. The crisp professional acknowledgement from my assistant through the speaker system shattered the last remnants of Vivian's delusion. She realized in that exact moment that she was not standing in front of the daughter she could bully, belittle, and cast aside. She was standing in the corporate fortress of a multimillionaire who held her entire life in the palm of her hand. I shifted my gaze directly to my mother. I told her that I was fully aware she had used my social security number to commit federal identity theft. I informed her that the bank had already handed the IP logs, the signature forgeries, and the surveillance footage from the bridal boutique over to their fraud division. I leaned back in my chair and delivered the final crushing blow. I told her that I absolutely refused to serve, accommodate, or harbor credit criminals on any of my private properties. Jada completely broke down. The pristine, entitled bridezilla persona vanished, replaced by a sobbing, panicked reality. She realized that her dream wedding was dead. There would be no chandeliers, no botanical gardens, no high society validation. She realized that the sister she had spent her entire life mocking was actually the gatekeeper to the world she desperately wanted to enter. Marcus stood entirely emasculated. His patriarchal authority, the booming voice he used to terrorize our household for decades, was rendered completely useless in my boardroom. He had no power here. He was just a loud man in a cheap suit standing in my kingdom. This was the exact moment Connor decided he needed to intervene. His fragile ego could not handle the scene unfolding in front of him. He could not process the reality that a black woman he had actively looked down upon, a woman he had threatened with text messages just 24 hours ago, held exponentially more wealth, power, and capital than he did. His proximity to whiteness and his fabricated tech bro persona demanded that he assert dominance. He pushed past Marcus and slammed his hand down on the glass table, leaning aggressively toward me. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. His voice was laced with pure, unfiltered venom. He told me that I was nothing but a lucky real estate flipper. He called me a piece of nouveau riche trash who had stumbled into a fortunate market cycle. He scoffed, claiming that managing event venues was a pathetic low-level operation compared to the real wealth generated in the technology sector. He squared his shoulders, trying to physically intimidate me from across the table. He announced that his tech startup was entering its final funding stage. He boasted loudly, his voice echoing off the glass walls, that by the end of this month, his company was securing a $5 million seed round from the most exclusive, ruthless venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. He puffed out his chest and dropped the name like it was a weapon of mass destruction. Apex Ventures. He smirked, thoroughly convinced he had just played the ultimate trump card. He threatened that the very moment the Apex money cleared his corporate accounts, he was going to personally buy the Magnolia estate, buy out my entire management firm, and have the pleasure of firing me and throwing me out on the street. He told me to enjoy my time in the leather chair because my reign was about to come to a very sudden, brutal end. The name dropped into the freezing air of the boardroom. Apex Ventures. My heart did not skip a beat. It did not flutter with anxiety or panic. Instead, it steadied into a slow, dark, predatory rhythm. The ambient noise of the city outside the window seemed to fade into absolute silence. I looked at Connor, standing there vibrating with unearned arrogance, believing he had just checkmated me with the ultimate display of elite tech wealth. He was so incredibly confident. He was so blindingly arrogant. He had absolutely no idea. He had no idea who sat on the board. He had no idea who signed the checks at Apex Ventures. A slow, deliberate, chilling smile spread across my face. It was a cold, sharp, terrifying expression that made the triumphant smirk completely vanish from Connor's lips. He faltered, his eyes narrowing as he tried to understand why his ultimate threat had not made me flinch. He did not know that he had just handed me the execution orders for his entire life on a silver platter. I let the silence stretch for exactly 10 seconds. Connor's chest was still puffed out, but the absolute stillness in the room was beginning to suffocate him. He shifted his weight, looking around the immaculate boardroom, waiting for someone to validate his performance. He expected me to cower. He expected me to panic at the sheer mention of a massive Silicon Valley firm coming to destroy my livelihood. I reached across my obsidian desk and tapped the glowing screen of my primary control tablet. With a swift swipe of my finger, I projected my secure desktop directly onto the massive 80-inch presentation screen mounted on the wall behind me. The room was instantly bathed in the crisp black and gold corporate logo of Apex Ventures. I kept my voice dangerously calm and perfectly level. I told Connor that he was absolutely right about one specific detail. Apex Ventures is indeed the most exclusive, ruthless, and highly capitalized firm in the entire valley. I told him they hold the power to make or break any startup that dares to walk through their doors. But I noted that he was catastrophically misinformed about exactly who signs those $5 million seed round checks. I tapped another button on my tablet. My official corporate profile flashed onto the massive screen. The text was large enough for my father to read without his glasses. It displayed my full name followed by my titles. Founder, Managing Partner, 80% controlling shareholder of Apex Ventures. The color drained from Connor's face so violently, I thought he might actually collapse onto the charcoal carpet. The arrogant, untouchable tech bro facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces in a fraction of a second. He stumbled backward, hitting the edge of a leather guest chair. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Marcus and Vivian snapped their heads toward the screen, their minds completely failing to process the reality in front of them. The daughter they had banished, the daughter they had called a spinster and a failure, Was the billionaire venture capitalist, their supposed savior, was currently begging for survival money. I did not give them a single second to recover from the shock. I leaned forward and told Connor that when a founder pitches Apex for a $5 million seed round, my analysts do not just glance at a pitch deck. We conduct a highly intrusive forensic due diligence protocol. We tear a founder's life apart to ensure our capital is protected. I opened a secondary folder on the presentation screen labeled Strictly Confidential. Connor's name and the logo of his pathetic startup were plastered across the top of the forensic audit report. I read the findings out loud, letting my voice bounce off the glass walls to ensure every single person in the room heard the absolute truth. I announced that Connor's revolutionary tech company possessed zero proprietary code. It had no viable product. It had no actual engineers on payroll. It was nothing more than a poorly constructed shell corporation designed to look legitimate on social media. I pulled up the deeply buried financial audits our forensic accountants had uncovered. I told the room that Connor was actively running a textbook Ponzi scheme. He was using new investor money to pay off the early backers to keep up the illusion of growth. And the well had run completely dry. His entire company was an illegal house of cards swaying in the wind. Then I scrolled down to his personal liabilities. I read the numbers with cold clinical precision. He had 3 maxed-out corporate credit cards, 2 defaulted business loans that were currently in collections. He was 6 months behind on the lease for his luxury vehicle, and his downtown bachelor pad had an active eviction notice pending. He was drowning in nearly $2 million of highly aggressive unsecured debt. He was financially radioactive. He was not an elite tech titan. He was a desperate broke grifter standing on the edge of a federal prison sentence. I turned my attention away from the trembling fraud and looked directly at Jada and my mother. I explained exactly why this fraudulent broke white man had attached himself to our family. I reminded Vivian of all the times she loudly bragged at country clubs, upscale restaurants, and family gatherings about our supposed generational wealth. I reminded her how she constantly boasted about our properties, our trusts, and our endless cash flow to anyone who would listen. Connor had heard those lies and saw a massive glowing lifeline. He realized he was targeting a family desperate for proximity to whiteness and perceived elite status. He played the part perfectly because he knew Vivian and Marcus would blind themselves to any red flags just to secure him as a son-in-law. He was not marrying Jada because he loved her. He was marrying her because he genuinely believed she was an heiress to a massive real estate empire. He was planning to marry into the family, secure access to our accounts, and drain my parents completely dry to pay off his angry investors and save himself from the authorities. Jada let out a whimpering gasp that sounded like a wounded animal. She looked at Connor, her eyes begging him to deny it. She wanted him to scream that I was just a bitter, jealous sister making up lies to ruin her wedding. But Connor could not even look at her. He was staring at his expensive shoes, his hands trembling violently, completely exposed as a predatory scam artist. Marcus and Vivian were frozen in a state of absolute unspeakable horror. The elite, wealthy son-in-law, they had worshipped the man they had chosen over their own flesh and blood. The man they had literally stolen my identity to impress was a parasite. They had destroyed their relationship with a legitimate self-made millionaire daughter to cater to a broke scam artist who viewed them as nothing more than a desperate payday. They had committed a federal credit crime to fund a wedding for a man who was actively planning to bankrupt them. I leaned back in my high-backed leather chair and folded my hands, resting them in my lap. I looked at Connor and delivered the final verdict. I told him that his $5 million funding request was officially permanently denied. I also informed him that as a legally mandated fiduciary, my firm does not ignore blatant financial crimes. I told him that our legal team had automatically forwarded the entire forensic due diligence file, including irrefutable proof of his Ponzi scheme, directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the FBI field office earlier that morning. Connor let out a panicked, choked noise. He turned and bolted for the boardroom doors, shoving past Jada and my father, without a single word of apology or explanation. He sprinted out of the executive suite, leaving his thoroughly destroyed fiancée crying uncontrollably in the middle of my boardroom. The silence in my boardroom after Connor sprinted out was absolute. My father Marcus and my mother Vivian stood there paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their own foolishness. I had security escort them out of the building shortly after letting them carry their weeping golden child through the lobby they had tried to terrorize just an hour earlier. I genuinely believed that providing them with undeniable federal evidence of Connor's crimes would shatter their delusion. I thought seeing the forensic audit would finally force them to accept reality. I underestimated the blinding power of self-hatred and the desperate need for social validation. Later that same evening, my personal phone rang. It was Marcus. His booming authoritarian tone was completely gone, replaced by a sickly sweet forced humility that made my skin crawl. He asked if we could meet for a private dinner at an exclusive steakhouse downtown. He said it was just going to be him and my mother to have a calm, rational family discussion. I knew exactly what they were doing, but morbid curiosity compelled me to accept the invitation. I wanted to look them in the eye and see exactly how deep their denial ran. I arrived at the steakhouse wearing a perfectly tailored emerald silk dress. The maitre d' led me to a secluded booth in the back where Marcus and Vivian were already waiting. The table was covered in expensive appetizers, and a bottle of my favorite vintage red wine was already breathing in a crystal decanter. They never remembered my favorite wine before today. The sudden attempt at performative parenting was transparent and pathetic. I sat down, crossed my legs, and waited for the performance to begin. Vivian poured me a glass of wine with trembling hands. She forced a bright, brittle smile and reached across the table, attempting to place her hand over mine. I smoothly pulled my hand back and picked up my glass. Her smile faltered, but she pushed through the rejection. She started by telling me how proud they were of my little investment business. She used the word little completely unironically, as if the multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm I had just introduced them to was a cute weekend hobby. Then she took a deep breath and launched into the most staggering display of mental gymnastics I have ever witnessed. She told me that they had spoken to Connor after the incident in my office. According to Vivian, Connor had calmly explained that my forensic audit was simply a gross misunderstanding of complex tech financing. He spun a ridiculous lie, claiming that his funds were tied up in offshore restructuring and that the federal investigation was just a standard corporate compliance check. He convinced my parents that he was still on the verge of becoming a billionaire and that I had maliciously manipulated the data to make him look bad. I took a slow sip of my wine, staring at them in absolute disbelief. I had handed them federal evidence of a Ponzi scheme, and they chose to believe the lies of a desperate broke scam artist who was currently running from the FBI. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on the white tablecloth. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of grave parental concern. He told me that I needed to understand how the real world operates. He looked me dead in the eye and said that Connor is a well-connected white man in an elite industry. He told me that men like Connor have access to powerful networks and generational wealth that I could not possibly fight against. My father, the man who was supposed to protect and uplift me, looked at his self-made millionaire daughter and told me I needed to back down. He warned me that if I embarrassed Connor and bruised his ego, he would hold a massive grudge. Marcus stated with absolute conviction that Connor could make a few phone calls to his elite white network and have my entire career destroyed overnight. He told me I was playing a highly dangerous game by disrespecting someone of Connor's demographic and status. The sheer pathetic subservience of his words hung in the air. My parents were so deeply conditioned by their own internalized inferiority that they literally worshipped the ground this fraudulent man walked on. They were terrified of a broke criminal simply because he fit their aesthetic ideal of high society. They genuinely believed his proximity to whiteness gave him an inherent supreme power over my hard-earned capital. Vivian jumped in to deliver the final demand. She told me that for the sake of the family name, I needed to be the bigger person and apologize for my aggressive behavior in the boardroom. She demanded that I unfreeze the stolen funds immediately and hand over the keys to the Magnolia estate free of charge. She claimed that if I just gave Connor the venue, it would prove to his investors that he was stable and everything would go back to normal. She begged me not to embarrass our family in front of the white elite. She said if I ruined this wedding, Jada would never forgive me, and the family reputation would be permanently stained. I gently set my wine glass down on the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger. I looked at the two people who brought me into this world, and I felt nothing but profound, icy pity. I leaned forward, mirroring my father's posture. I told them that their desperate worship of this man was the most embarrassing thing I had ever witnessed. I reminded them that Connor does not have an elite network. He does not have generational wealth. He has an active warrant and a negative bank balance. I told them that no amount of apologizing or free real estate was going to save a man from federal prison. I looked at my father and dismantled his entire worldview in 3 sentences. I told him that I am the elite network he is so terrified of. I am the one who makes the phone calls that destroy careers. I reminded him that I hold the power, the capital, and the influence, and I do not bow down to broke men who try to scam my family regardless of their skin color or their zip code. I told my mother that the wedding was permanently canceled, and the funds would remain frozen until the police concluded their identity theft investigation. I advised them to stop worrying about pleasing high society and start worrying about finding a very good criminal defense attorney for the credit fraud they had committed. I stood up from the booth, leaving my dinner untouched. I dropped a $50 bill on the table to cover my glass of wine. I looked down at their stunned, terrified faces and told them to never contact me to negotiate on behalf of a criminal ever again. I turned my back on their desperate pleas and walked out of the restaurant, leaving them alone with the devastating reality of their own self-hatred. I stepped out of the steakhouse and took a deep breath of the crisp city air. Leaving my parents sitting in the ruins of their own delusions felt like shedding a physical weight I had carried for decades. I had given them the absolute truth, and they actively chose to protect a parasite. That was their final choice. They had made their bed, and now I was completely free to handle Connor without a single ounce of restraint or familial obligation. The next morning, I walked into my penthouse office at Apex Ventures, feeling entirely invigorated. The morning sun reflected off the floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking the financial district, serving as a daily reminder of the untouchable empire I had built from the ground up. My executive assistant Elena was waiting by my obsidian desk with a stiff, thick envelope sent via priority certified mail. It had arrived just moments before I stepped off the private elevator. I sliced open the envelope with a silver letter opener and pulled out a stack of heavily watermarked paper. It was a formal cease and desist notice printed on the cheap, textured letterhead of a strip mall law firm. I read the opening lines and actually had to pause to contain a sharp laugh. The document was addressed to me, but it explicitly listed my official title as Senior Property Manager of the Magnolia Estate. The absolute staggering arrogance of this man was almost impressive. Despite witnessing my presentation in the executive boardroom, despite seeing the corporate branding and the forensic audit, Connor's fragile ego had completely rewritten reality overnight. His brain simply could not process the fact that a black woman he viewed as entirely beneath him was actually a billionaire venture capitalist. To protect his own self-worth, he had convinced himself that my entire Apex Ventures presentation was a highly elaborate vindictive bluff. He genuinely believed I was just a bitter, low-level venue coordinator who had hacked a slideshow to humiliate him in front of his future in-laws. He thought I was playing dress-up in a borrowed office. He thought his assumed racial and gender superiority would easily paralyze me with fear. The letter demanded that I immediately retract the quote-unquote fraudulent financial documents I had presented to Marcus and Vivian. It ordered me to reinstate his wedding venue contract at zero cost as compensation for severe emotional distress and reputational damage. It threatened that if I did not comply within 24 hours, his tech company would sue me personally for tortious interference, defamation, and corporate sabotage. He actually thought a boilerplate legal threat from a bargain bin attorney would force me to cower in fear and hand over my assets. I placed the pathetic crumpled letter down on my desk. He wanted to play legal games. He wanted to test the limits of my authority and put me back in my designated place. He was about to experience the most catastrophic reality check of his entire miserable life. I reached forward and pressed the secure communication button on my console, initiating a priority video conference. Within 60 seconds, the high-definition screens on my office wall flickered to life. The executive board of directors and the primary legal counsel for Apex Ventures were looking back at me, awaiting my directives. These were 7 of the most ruthless financial minds in the industry, and they answered exclusively to me. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I held up the cease and desist letter to the camera so every single board member could see the pathetic attempt at intimidation. I kept my voice cold, calculating, and stripped of all emotion. I told the board that the founder of the tech startup we had been vetting for a $5 million seed round had just attempted to threaten me with legal action. I instructed my lead counsel to formally tear up the pending term sheets right this second. I declared that Apex Ventures was officially pulling all funding considerations permanently. But I did not stop there. When a founder enters preliminary diligence with a venture capital firm, they sign binding agreements granting us deep, unfettered access to their financial infrastructure. They open their books to prove they are worthy of our capital. Connor had eagerly signed those documents months ago, hoping to secure a payday. I looked directly at my head of risk management through the screen. I ordered him to trigger the Extreme Emergency Comprehensive Audit Clause immediately. I told him to take the forensic evidence of the Ponzi scheme we had already uncovered, the doctored revenue sheets, the phantom engineers, and the illegal commingling of investor funds, and hand-deliver it to the federal financial regulators. I leaned into the microphone and gave my final, absolute command. I told my team to execute a complete and total financial freeze on his company. I wanted every corporate account, every line of credit, and every operational fund associated with his name locked down by the authorities tonight. I told them to coordinate with our contacts at the Securities and Exchange Commission and ensure that his fraudulent empire burned to the ground before the sun came up tomorrow. The board members nodded in unison. There was no hesitation and no debate. They knew exactly how the system worked, and they knew better than to question my judgment when it came to neutralizing a threat to our capital. The screens went dark, leaving me alone in my quiet, sunlit office. I walked over to the window and looked out at the city below. Connor thought he could use a cheap lawyer to bully a woman he deemed inferior. He thought his proximity to whiteness gave him an invisible shield against consequence. He assumed I was a powerless spectator in his grand illusion of success. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed a loaded weapon directly to the executioner. Tonight he would learn exactly what happens when you threaten the person who holds the keys to the entire kingdom. He was about to lose his business, his freedom, and his carefully constructed identity, all because his ego refused to believe that a black woman could hold absolute power over his destiny. The trap was set, the doors were locked, and the total destruction of Connor was officially underway. The financial markets opened the next morning with the subtle but devastating impact of a synchronized strike. In the venture capital world, reputation is the only currency that actually matters. When Apex Ventures formally withdraws from a seed round, it raises eyebrows. When Apex Ventures actively flags a founder for a federal compliance review, it triggers an absolute stampede. By 9 o'clock, the Whisper network of Silicon Valley and the local tech sector had fully mobilized. Every angel investor, mid-level capital firm, and private backer that Connor had managed to trick over the past year suddenly realized their money was in severe danger. The panic was instantaneous and highly contagious. My tablet lit up with real-time intelligence reports from my risk management team. The dominoes were falling exactly as I had orchestrated. Across town, Connor was waking up to a living nightmare. I could perfectly envision the chaos unfolding in his overpriced, leased downtown apartment. His phone would be vibrating right off the nightstand. His inbox would be overflowing with aggressive demands from early investors threatening immediate litigation if their funds were not wired back by the end of the business day. They wanted their money, and they wanted it right then, but he could not wire a single cent. When Connor desperately tried to log into his corporate banking portals to move whatever remaining cash he had hidden away, he hit a solid, impenetrable brick wall. Every single account was flagged with a federal hold. The credit cards he used to fund his lavish dinners, buy Jada expensive gifts, and maintain his designer wardrobe were completely declined. The financial guillotine had dropped overnight, severing his access to the fake wealth he used to build his entire identity. I sat at my obsidian desk reviewing the updates as they rolled in. The sheer speed of his collapse was breathtaking. He would have undoubtedly rushed to his rented office space, hoping to salvage something tangible, maybe grab hard drives or shred physical documents. But the reality of a Securities and Exchange Commission investigation moves much faster than a panicked scam artist. By noon, the glass doors of his startup headquarters were locked and chained. Federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division were already inside, packing his leased computers and falsified ledgers into cardboard boxes. The shiny corporate logo on the wall meant absolutely nothing when the authorities arrived to secure the premises. The shell company he used to lure in my desperate status-obsessed family was officially a crime scene. Connor's carefully curated facade shattered into a million jagged pieces. He had spent years coasting on unearned confidence. He leveraged his demographic and a few well-placed tech buzzwords to manipulate vulnerable, desperate people like my mother and sister. He thought he was completely untouchable. He believed his own lies so deeply that he actually thought he could outsmart the federal banking system and intimidate a billionaire. But when the government freezes your assets and seizes your server's white privilege, and a tailored suit cannot save you from the consequences of a Ponzi scheme, he had no influential network to call for a bailout. The wealthy friends and powerful mentors he always bragged about at my parents' dinner table instantly distanced themselves the second the word fraud hit the rumor mill. Nobody in high society wants to catch the collateral damage of a federal indictment. His associates blocked his number. His country club acquaintances pretended they barely knew him. He was completely isolated, stripped of his fake elite persona, and reduced to exactly what he was all along. A broke, desperate criminal waiting for a pair of handcuffs. The irony was beautiful. Just 24 hours ago, he had sent me a threatening legal letter demanding I bow to his authority. He had promised to destroy my career and buy my company. Now he did not even have the liquidity to buy a cup of coffee. His luxury car, which was months behind on lease payments, was likely already out for repossession. His landlord would be drafting a formal eviction notice before the end of the week. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office, feeling a profound, quiet sense of closure. The threat he posed to my assets and my peace of mind was permanently neutralized. I did not have to raise my voice or engage in a screaming match. I simply utilized the power of the truth and let the weight of his own lies crush him. But the destruction of Connor was only half the battle. The shockwaves of his catastrophic collapse were about to hit my family with the force of a freight train. They had mortgaged their entire social identity, their pride, and their legal standing on this man. They had literally committed identity theft to fund a luxury wedding to a mirage. And that mirage had just evaporated into thin air, leaving them holding the bag. The reckoning I had promised was finally arriving at their doorstep. The morning sun had barely crested the city skyline when the reality of Connor's collapse violently crashed into my sister's world. Jada had spent the night at Connor's leased luxury apartment, likely nursing her bruised ego after the disastrous scene at my corporate office. She was probably expecting to wake up, drink a matcha latte, and listen to him spin more lies about how his elite lawyers were going to fix everything. Instead, she woke up to the sound of heavy fists hammering against the custom mahogany front door. Before Connor could even stumble out of bed to check the intercom, the door was breached. Federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division poured into the penthouse. They did not care about the expensive modern art on the walls or the panoramic views. They moved with absolute, terrifying precision. They were executing a federal search and seizure warrant, and they were stripping the apartment down to the studs. Jada stood in the hallway clutching her silk robe, screaming at the agents. She was completely trapped in her delusional influencer bubble. She actually tried to use Connor's fake status as a shield. She yelled that they were making a massive mistake, that her fiancé was a Silicon Valley titan, and that they would all lose their jobs for disrespecting a powerful tech executive. One of the lead investigators, a stern woman holding a thick clipboard, looked at Jada with a mixture of pity and exhaustion. She calmly informed my sister that Connor was not a tech executive. She stated that he was the primary suspect in a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme, and that every single asset in the apartment was currently being seized as evidence of federal wire fraud. Jada watched in absolute horror as the agents began confiscating the physical proof of Connor's fake wealth. They took the keys to his luxury sports car, which the investigator noted was 6 months behind on lease payments. They boxed up his collection of designer watches, casually mentioning that half of them were cheap replicas. They seized his laptops, his encrypted hard drives, and every piece of financial documentation they could find in his home office. Connor did not puff out his chest. He did not threaten to call his high-powered lawyers. The arrogant, untouchable white savior, who had mocked my family and threatened my career, was currently sitting on his expensive velvet sofa, crying like a cornered coward. He could not even look Jada in the eye. But the absolute worst revelation was yet to come. As the agents sorted through the files on Connor's desk, the lead investigator pulled out a specific legal folder. She asked Connor to verify a pending financial transaction. Jada, desperate for any explanation, moved closer to look at the paperwork. Her heart stopped completely. It was a secondary mortgage application. Connor had not just been scamming his venture capital investors. He had been actively grooming my parents for the ultimate financial slaughter. Recognizing that his Ponzi scheme was on the verge of total collapse, Connor had presented Marcus and Vivian with a massive stack of legal documents earlier that month. He had manipulated their desperate need for white validation and their blind trust in his supposed business acumen. He told them the paperwork was for a joint real estate investment vehicle that would triple their net worth before the wedding. Marcus and Vivian were so starstruck by the idea of partnering with a tech billionaire that they signed the documents without consulting a single independent lawyer. They had unknowingly signed the deed to their sprawling custom-built home over as collateral. Connor was just days away from finalizing a predatory loan against my parents' house to pay off his furious early investors. He was actively planning to take the cash, abandon the failing startup, and leave my parents entirely responsible for the massive debt. He was going to let the bank foreclose on the house they had spent 30 years paying for. He was going to render my parents completely homeless just to save his own skin. Jada stared at the mortgage documents, the reality of her choices finally crushing the breath out of her lungs. The man she had chosen over her own sister, the man she had worshipped and weaponized against me, was a ruthless parasite. He did not love her. He was actively destroying her family for a quick payout. Before Jada could even process the magnitude of this betrayal, her phone began to ring. It was not my mother calling to check on her. It was her elite, highly sought-after wedding planner. Jada answered the phone with a trembling hand, only to be met with outright screaming. The wedding planner was furious. She informed Jada that the new credit card they had provided, the one linked to the fraudulent account they opened using my stolen identity, had been permanently frozen by the bank. The dominoes were falling rapidly from every direction. Because the card was declined, the massive payments required to secure the vendors had all bounced simultaneously. The premium florist, who was sourcing tens of thousands of dollars in imported orchids, had officially terminated their contract. The luxury catering company that demanded a 50% upfront deposit had canceled their reservation and sent a breach of contract notice. The custom invitation designer, the string quartet, the elite videography team, they were all dropping out and demanding immediate compensation for their wasted time. Jada tried to speak, trying to beg the wedding planner for just a few more days to sort out the financing, but the planner was absolutely ruthless. She told Jada that word of the credit fraud had already spread through the tight-knit luxury event community. Nobody was willing to work with a family that bounced high five-figure checks. The planner formally resigned on the spot and threatened to take Jada to small claims court for her unpaid retainer. Jada dropped her phone onto the hardwood floor, the screen shattered, perfectly mirroring the complete destruction of her fake life. There would be no wedding at the Magnolia estate. There would be no crystal chandeliers, no imported flowers, and no grand entrance into high society. There would be no wealthy, powerful husband to elevate her status. She was standing in the middle of an active federal crime scene, engaged to a broke-crying scam artist who had tried to steal her parents' home. And she had committed felony identity theft to fund a dream that never actually existed. She had sacrificed her relationship with me, a sister who had a literal billion-dollar portfolio and the power to actually give her everything she wanted, all for a pathetic racist illusion. The dream wedding was officially dead, and the nightmare of the consequences had only just begun. I sit back on my velvet sofa in the quiet sanctuary of my penthouse. The afternoon sun is beginning to dip below the city skyline, casting a warm golden hour glow across my living room. The sheer tranquility of my space stands in absolute contrast to the digital war zone currently exploding on my coffee table. My phone has been vibrating so violently and continuously that it is slowly inching its way across the marble surface. I pick up the device and look at the screen. The numbers are staggering. 150 missed calls, 50 new voicemails, hundreds of text messages flooding in from my mother, my father, and my sister. The notifications paint a vivid, real-time picture of their complete psychological collapse. The arrogant demands from Christmas Eve have entirely vanished. The condescending tone they carried into my corporate boardroom is gone. Now there is nothing left but pure, unfiltered panic. I pour myself a fresh glass of Cabernet Swirl, the dark red liquid, and press play on the first voicemail. The audio crackles to life, filling my quiet living room with the sound of Jada sobbing uncontrollably. The background noise is chaotic. I can hear the distinct sound of heavy boots moving across hardwood floors and male voices giving sharp official commands. The federal agents are clearly still tearing apart Connor's apartment. Jada's voice is high-pitched and breathless. She is hyperventilating, begging me to answer the phone. She cries out that they put Connor in handcuffs and marched him out through the lobby in front of all the other wealthy residents. She pleads with me, her voice cracking with desperation. She says, "I know you own Apex Ventures. I know you have the power to stop this. Please, Nia, just call your lawyers and tell the FBI there was a misunderstanding. Tell them you will cover his debts. Please, he is going to federal prison and I have absolutely nothing left." I take a slow sip of my wine. Jada still does not grasp how the real world operates. She genuinely believes that because I hold wealth and corporate power, I can simply wave a magic wand and make federal wire fraud disappear. She spent her entire life skating by on pretty privilege and my mother's endless coddling. She assumes I will step into the role of the protective older sister and shield her from the consequences of her own horrific choices. She wants me to bail out the exact same man who insulted my career and threatened to destroy my life just 48 hours ago. I delete the voicemail and move to the text messages. My mother Vivian has sent a wall of text that reads like a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. She has completely abandoned the aggressive, commanding persona she used to banish me from the family. Now she is weaponizing the concept of family loyalty, the very same concept she weaponized to justify stealing my identity. Her messages start with frantic updates about their catastrophic financial situation. She writes that Connor completely tricked my father. She explains that the loan documents Marcus signed were not for a joint investment, but a direct collateral claim on their family home. The bank has already called them, notifying them that the primary mortgage is in severe default due to Connor's fraudulent activities. Then her texts take a significantly darker turn. Vivian reveals that it is not just the federal authorities they are worried about. Connor did not just scam legitimate venture capitalists. In his desperate attempt to keep his Ponzi scheme afloat, he apparently borrowed heavily from private, unregulated lenders. Dangerous people who do not use corporate lawyers to collect their debts. Vivian writes that strange men have been calling my father's personal cell phone demanding their money back. They know Marcus signed as a guarantor for Connor's shell company. Vivian's final message is a master manipulation tactic wrapped in a desperate plea. She writes that I am her daughter and that we share the same blood. She begs me to remember that family protects family. She pleads with me to use my massive wealth to pay off the dangerous lenders and save their house from immediate foreclosure. She says I cannot possibly stand by and watch my own parents become homeless and hunted by criminals. She ends the text by saying she is sorry for any past misunderstandings and promises that if I just write this one check, they will finally respect me. I set the phone down and let out a soft, humorless laugh. A misunderstanding. That is what she calls decades of emotional abuse, public humiliation, and a literal felony identity theft. A simple misunderstanding. My father Marcus left the final voicemail. I press play. The booming authoritarian voice that used to terrorize our household is completely gone. He sounds broken, exhausted, and entirely defeated. He does not yell. He does not demand. He simply asks if I can find it in my heart to meet with him. He admits that he made a catastrophic misjudgment regarding Connor. He softly mentions that his pride blinded him and that he is terrified for his and my mother's safety. He asks me, as the successful daughter he should have always valued, to step in and fix the disaster he created. I sit in the silence of my penthouse after the audio finishes playing. I think back to that Christmas dinner table. I remember the absolute conviction in my father's voice when he told me I was obligated to fund my sister's extravagant lifestyle. I remember the cruel, triumphant smile on my mother's face when she pointed at the front door and told me I was completely dead to the family. I remember the way Jada looked at Connor, as if he were a god while treating me like a disposable ATM. They had demanded $100,000 to throw a luxury party for a white con artist. Now they need millions of dollars just to stay out of federal prison and keep a roof over their heads. They expect me to be their savior. They expect the societal conditioning of the strong black woman to kick in. They assume I will automatically shoulder the burden of their failures, sacrifice my own capital, and rescue them simply because we happen to share a last name. They believe that my capacity for forgiveness is as endless as my bank account. But I am not the scapegoat anymore. I am not the quiet sister who swallows her pride to keep the peace. I am a self-made billionaire who operates in the most ruthless financial sector in the world. I did not build an untouchable empire by bailing out terrible investments, and I certainly do not reward people who commit identity theft against me. The most powerful realization washes over me. I do not feel an ounce of guilt. I do not feel a shred of obligation to save them from the burning building they deliberately locked themselves inside. They worshipped a fraud because he offered them the illusion of elite status. They sacrificed their real daughter on the altar of his fake prestige. Now the illusion is shattered and the bill has finally come due. I pick up my phone one last time. I do not block their numbers just yet. I need to deliver one final message. I need to make absolutely certain that they understand the new reality. The power dynamic has not just shifted, it has been completely rewritten. I open the family group chat, the same group chat where they spent the last week actively mocking me and preparing for a wedding that will never happen. I watch the typing bubbles pop up as my mother and sister furiously try to send more desperate pleas. I ignore them all and begin to type my response. I keep my eyes locked on the glowing screen of my phone, watching the absolute digital carnage unfold in the family group chat. There are 60 relatives crammed into this massive thread. These are the exact same 60 people who sat around that oversized dining table on Christmas Eve eating the turkey I paid for, while aggressively nodding along as my mother demanded I fund a fraudulent white man's luxury lifestyle. Just a few days ago, this chat was a continuous stream of wedding mood boards, seeding chart discussions and subtle, passive-aggressive digs at my marital status. Now it has devolved into an apocalyptic war zone. The panic is palpable even through text. I scroll up slightly to read the backlog of chaos. The hypocrisy is staggering. Aunt Valerie, the woman who told me I was a bitter embarrassment to black women everywhere, is sending long paragraphs entirely in all caps. She is frantically demanding to know how Connor could have done this, because she apparently handed him $20,000 of her own retirement savings for his fake real estate investment vehicle. Uncle Jerome, who told me I should feel privileged to empty my bank account for my sister, is threatening physical violence in the chat, claiming he took out a second mortgage to invest in Connor's tech startup. They had all bought into the illusion. They had all bent over backward to worship a scam artist simply because he promised them proximity to elite wealth. They had eagerly participated in my public humiliation to secure their own spots in his imaginary kingdom. And now that the kingdom was actively burning to the ground with federal agents swarming the gates, they were turning on each other like cornered animals. My mother is desperately trying to maintain order in the chat, typing out frantic messages, telling everyone to calm down and stop talking about the FBI. She is begging the extended family to stop spreading rumors, claiming there has just been a banking error, and that I am going to step in and resolve the liquidity issue. She is still actively lying to them. She is still trying to use my name as a shield to protect her shattered ego. I watch the typing bubbles pop up as my father Marcus tries to call my uncle to calm him down. Jada is completely silent in the group, likely sitting on the floor of Connor's seized apartment, realizing that she is about to be dragged into a massive federal indictment. They are all waiting for me to speak. They know I am reading the messages. They are holding their breath, praying that the successful billionaire daughter they threw away will swoop in, write a massive check to the authorities, pay off the angry relatives, and magically restore their fake upper-middle-class utopia. They expect the strong black woman trope to override my own self-respect. They expect me to play the savior. I pick up my crystal wine glass and take a slow, deliberate sip of the Cabernet. The rich, dark flavor hits my palate, grounding me perfectly in the present moment. I set the glass down on the marble coaster with a soft click. I open the keyboard on my phone. My fingers hover over the glass screen. I do not feel a single drop of adrenaline. My heart is beating at a perfectly calm resting rate. There is no anger left in my body. There is no sadness. There is only the absolute pristine clarity of a woman who has finally excised a terminal tumor from her life. I do not type a long emotional paragraph. I do not explain my trauma or outline the pain they caused me. Giving them an emotional response would only give them ammunition to call me dramatic. I will not give them the satisfaction of knowing they ever hurt me. I keep my final words sharp, clinical, and devastatingly precise. I type my message into the text box. Family is meant to protect one another. It is not meant to be a financial parasite that drains its own blood to harbor a literal fraudster. I will not be paying your ransoms, and I will not be saving your house. I wish Jada a truly spectacular wedding day standing in front of a federal judge. I do not hesitate. I do not second-guess myself. I press send. I watch the green text bubble slide into the chaotic chat. The impact is instantaneous. The frantic stream of messages from my aunts and uncles abruptly stops. The typing indicator, bubbles from my mother and father, instantly vanish. For 3 glorious seconds, there is nothing but absolute paralyzed digital silence across the entire network of 60 relatives. I can see the read receipts dropping down rapidly beneath my message as every single person in that chat processes the reality of my words. They realize simultaneously that the bank is permanently closed, and they have been left completely alone to face the catastrophic consequences of their own greed. I do not wait for their responses. I do not care what excuses they try to formulate or what insults they try to hurl in their final moments of desperation. I tap the group settings icon at the top of the screen. I scroll past the long list of names of people who sat by and watched me be abused for decades. I reach the bottom of the menu. I stare at the bright red text that reads, Leave Group. The system prompts me with a final confirmation, asking if I am sure I want to permanently exit the conversation. I have never been more sure of a single decision in my entire 33 years of existence. I firmly press confirm. The group chat instantly vanishes from my screen, replaced by my empty message inbox. But I am not finished. I open my phone settings, navigate to my contact list, and execute a mass blocking protocol. I block my mother's number. I block my father's number. I block Jada. I systematically block every single aunt, uncle, and cousin who participated in that toxic Christmas dinner. I sever every digital and telephonic connection to that bloodline. I lock my phone screen. The device goes completely black. I place the phone face down on the cool marble of my coffee table. I lean back deep into the plush velvet cushions of my sofa. The camera view slowly begins to pull backward, tracking away from me in a smooth cinematic glide. The lavish details of my penthouse, the modern art, the glowing fireplace, the endless expanse of the city skyline through the glass slowly widen into the frame. I cross my legs and close my eyes. I take a deep, slow breath, inhaling the quiet luxury of a life I built entirely with my own two hands. There is no more screaming. There are no more demands. There are no more toxic expectations or forced family loyalties. The invisible heavy chains of generational trauma have been completely shattered. Somewhere across the city, my parents are drowning in a financial disaster of their own making. My sister is facing the absolute destruction of her fake reality and the criminal consequences of her choices. They are sinking rapidly into the miserable ruins they spent their entire lives building. But here in my sanctuary, high above the city streets, there is nothing but absolute total silence. It is the most beautiful sound I have ever heard. I let a genuine peaceful smile spread across my face. I am completely satisfied. I am entirely untouchable. And for the first time in my life, I am finally entirely free. The story we just walked through is not merely a tale of dramatic revenge or a display of financial triumph. It is a profound exploration of human psychology, generational trauma, and the terrifying cost of living a life dictated by false appearances. When the dust finally settles and the screens go dark, what remains is a powerful lesson about self-worth and the ultimate price of toxic family loyalty. For decades, society has conditioned us to believe that blood relations are sacred and unbreakable. We are taught from a very young age that family protects family, and that we must endure all manner of disrespect simply because we share a last name. But this narrative exposes the dark underbelly of that cultural myth. The most crucial lesson we can take away from this entire ordeal is that biological connection does not automatically grant someone a lifelong license to abuse, manipulate, or exploit you. True loyalty is earned through mutual respect, protection, and unconditional care. When a family operates like a transactional business, where your value is strictly determined by how much you can fund their delusions or stroke their fragile egos, it ceases to be a family. It becomes a parasitic ecosystem. The protagonist in our story realized that staying in that environment meant setting herself on fire just to keep her abusers warm. We often trap ourselves in miserable situations because we confuse guilt with love. The parents weaponized the concept of family duty only when it benefited them financially, yet they completely discarded those same family values when they publicly humiliated their daughter. Walking away from toxic relatives is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound self-preservation. You are allowed to outgrow the people who refuse to grow with you. You are allowed to permanently close the door on anyone who requires you to shrink yourself just so they can feel big. The second major lesson is the catastrophic danger of prioritizing social status over authentic reality. The family's downfall was not caused by a lack of money. It was caused by a desperate, blinding hunger for external validation. They were so consumed by the desire to be perceived as elite that they completely abandoned their critical thinking. They worshipped a fraudulent man simply because he fit their aesthetic ideal of success and proximity to whiteness. They were willing to sacrifice their own brilliant self-made daughter to cater to an illusion. This happens so often in our society. People mortgage their actual happiness, their financial security, and their moral compass just to impress strangers on the internet or acquaintances at a country club. When you build your entire identity on the shaky foundation of what other people think of you, you become incredibly vulnerable to manipulators who know exactly how to exploit your insecurities. True power and genuine wealth do not need to scream for attention. They do not require you to tear down your own flesh and blood to prove a point. The loud, arrogant boasting of the scam artist was an empty shell, while the quiet, disciplined execution of the protagonist was the real empire. Furthermore, this story teaches us that financial independence is the ultimate boundary against manipulation. When you control your own resources, you control your own destiny. The protagonist did not need her parents' approval because she did not rely on their shelter or their financial support. Building your own life brick by brick, away from toxic influences, gives you the unparalleled luxury of choice. It gives you the ability to stand up at a table full of people who are disrespecting you, drop $100 bill, and walk out into the night without worrying about where you will sleep. But power is not just about having capital, it is about emotional regulation and discipline. In toxic family systems, the roles are assigned very early on. The golden child is coddled, protected from consequences, and praised for simply existing. The scapegoat is blamed for every failure, held to impossible standards, and expected to carry the emotional burdens of the entire household. The sister in this story was allowed to live in a fantasy world, completely shielded from accountability, until the real world came crashing through her front door in the form of federal agents. The parents enabled this delusion because it fed their own narcissism. Breaking out of the scapegoat role requires an immense amount of courage because it means accepting that the family dynamic will never magically become healthy. You have to mourn the parents and the siblings you deserved but never actually had. You have to grieve the illusion of the happy family. Once you push through that grief, the clarity you gain is extraordinary. You realize that you were never the problem. You were simply the mirror reflecting their flaws back at them, and they hated you for it. The greatest revenge you can ever achieve against those who try to destroy you is not a screaming match. It is not a physical altercation or a bitter back-and-forth argument. The ultimate revenge is absolute, impenetrable silence. When you deny toxic people the emotional reaction they are desperately trying to provoke you, strip them of all their power. They want you to cry. They want you to yell. They want you to look crazy so they can justify their terrible behavior. By staying calm, collecting the evidence, and letting the natural consequences of their own actions crush them, you win the war without ever raising your voice. There is a profound peace that comes when you finally stop trying to prove your worth to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You do not have to convince them. You just have to leave them behind. The quiet penthouse at the end of the story is not just a symbol of financial wealth. It is a symbol of mental clarity. It represents a sanctuary built on truth, hard work, and the absolute refusal to compromise one's dignity. When you stop fighting for a seat at a table where you are not respected, you free up all that energy to build your own table. If you are ready to stop shrinking yourself to fit into places you have outgrown, hit the subscribe button and share this with someone who needs the courage to walk away today.